Hi, I'm Victoria Lewis, and at 34, I'm the woman my husband thought he could destroy. The day he served me divorce papers in front of his golf buddies, laughing about finally trading up, he had no idea I'd been quietly building an empire worth $127 million. When he thought I was just a housewife organizing charity events, I was actually running the most successful anonymous investment firm on the East Coast. So when he demanded I sign away my rights to his assets, I smiled, signed everything, and kept my mouth shut about the offshore accounts he'd never find. 6 months later, when the truth finally surfaced, his smug grin disappeared faster than his new girlfriend when she realized what she'd gotten herself into. Before we dive in, what's your guess on how this story ends? And have you ever had someone underestimate you so completely that their shock became your victory? Drop your thoughts below. And please like and subscribe. The October wind carried that familiar bite of approaching winter as I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of our Beacon Hill penthouse. Boston stretched out below me, the harbor gleaming like scattered diamonds under the afternoon sun. The view had always calmed me, but today it felt different, like I was seeing it for the last time as the person I used to be. Behind me, I could hear Marcus's voice booming from the dining room, that practiced laugh he used when he wanted to impress someone. He'd invited his inner circle over for what he called a celebration lunch, though I suspected it was more about showing off than celebrating anything meaningful. Victoria's finally agreed to be reasonable, he was saying, his tone dripping with the kind of false magnanimity that made my skin crawl. Sometimes you have to know when to cut your losses, gentlemen. I turned from the window, smoothing my cream-colored dress, the one he'd bought me last Christmas because he said it made me look appropriately elegant. At the time, I'd thanked him. Today, I wore it like armor. The dining room was exactly as I'd expected. Marcus sat at the head of our mahogany table, his Harvard Business School ring catching the light as he gestured with his whiskey glass. Around him sat his usual suspects, Richard Blackwood from the country club, James Patterson from his law firm, and Dr. Michael Hayes, his tennis partner and longtime friend. "Ah, there she is," Marcus said as I entered, not bothering to stand. "Gentlemen, my soon-to-be ex-wife, Victoria. She's been quite accommodating about our little arrangement." The way he said accommodating made it sound like I was a service he'd hired and was now dismissing. Richard smirked into his scotch. James shuffled some papers, probably the divorce documents. Dr. Hayes had the decency to look uncomfortable, but not enough to say anything. "Victoria," Marcus continued, "why don't you tell the boys about your new living situation? I think they'll find it appropriate for someone in your position." My position. As if I were a subordinate being reassigned rather than a wife of 8 years who'd helped build everything he claimed as his own. "I found a lovely apartment in Cambridge," I said, my voice steady. "Small but perfect for my needs." What I didn't mention was that the lovely apartment was a carefully chosen cover story. The modest 2-bedroom I'd signed the lease for was indeed in Cambridge, but it was just one of 17 properties I owned across 3 states. Marcus had no idea that while he thought I was planning charity galas and tennis matches, I'd been quietly building a real estate portfolio that most developers would envy. "Cambridge," Dr. Hayes said, trying to inject some warmth into the conversation. "That's nice. Close to Harvard, academic atmosphere." "Perfect for someone starting over," Marcus added with that same theatrical sympathy. "Victoria's always been more of a small-town girl anyway. Boston high society was probably too much pressure." The irony was almost beautiful. While Marcus spent his days managing other people's money and taking credit for market gains he'd had little to do with, I'd been making trades that had turned my grandmother's $50,000 inheritance into something he couldn't comprehend. Every charity lunch, every society meeting, every tennis game had been cover for phone calls to my brokers, meetings with my accountants, and carefully orchestrated acquisitions that had been flying under his radar for 6 years. "I'm sure I'll adjust," I said, taking a small sip of the wine I'd barely touched. James Patterson cleared his throat, sliding a folder across the table. "The final papers, if you're ready to sign." Very straightforward. You keep your personal items, Marcus retains all marital assets, and there's a modest settlement to help with your transition. Modest. The settlement Marcus was offering me was $50,000, less than I made in interest in a single month. He was being generous, he'd told me, considering I'd never really contributed financially to the marriage. I picked up the pen, its weight familiar in my hand. These same fingers had signed contracts worth millions, had authored investment strategies that had made my silent partners wealthier than they dreamed. But to everyone in this room, they were just the hands of a woman who'd spent 8 years arranging flowers and hosting dinner parties. You know, Richard said, settling back in his chair, this is probably the best thing for both of you. Marcus needs someone who can keep up with his lifestyle, and you, well, you'll be happier with something simpler. Someone who can keep up with his lifestyle. Like Isabel Cunningham, the 28-year-old interior designer who'd been consulting on Marcus's office redesign for the past 6 months. She was everything I apparently wasn't, young, ambitious in the obvious ways, and impressed by the kind of surface-level success that Marcus mistook for actual power. I think you're right, I said, signing the first page with deliberate care. Some of us are meant for different things. As I worked through the documents, I thought about the conversation I'd had with my real lawyer, not the one Marcus thought was representing me, but Sarah Chen, the shark I'd hired 6 months ago when I first suspected where this marriage was heading. Sarah had laughed when I showed her the prenup Marcus thought protected him. He's so focused on protecting his assets, she'd said, he never considered that you might have your own. The prenup was ironclad when it came to Marcus's investment firm, his trust fund, and the properties he'd owned before our marriage. But it said nothing about assets acquired independently during the marriage, assets held in corporations he'd never heard of, or investments made under my maiden name. While he'd been building his reputation, I'd been building my fortune. I signed the last page and slid the folder back to James. There. All finished. Marcus raised his glass. To new beginnings and knowing your place in the world. The other men lifted their glasses, though Dr. Hayes's enthusiasm seemed forced. I raised my water glass and smiled. To knowing exactly where you stand, I agreed. What none of them knew was that tomorrow morning, Marcus would discover that 3 of his biggest clients had quietly moved their portfolios to other firms. Not because I'd asked them to, I'd never be so crude, but because those clients were actually front companies for my investment group, and our contracts had very specific termination clauses. By next week, he'd realized that the modest apartment building I was moving into was actually the building where his new office lease had just been signed. The lease he thought he'd negotiated so brilliantly was actually with a property management company I'd acquired 2 months ago. And by next month, when Isabel figured out that Marcus's lifestyle was propped up by borrowed money and leveraged assets, she'd discover that the credit lines he'd been using to impress her had been quietly called in by institutions that answered to investment groups with my name buried deep in their corporate structures. But today, I just smiled and let them believe they were watching a woman accept her diminished place in the world. The truth was, I was finally free to stop pretending to be smaller than I was. Well, gentlemen, I said, standing, I should let you get back to your celebration. I have packing to do. I walked toward the door, then paused and turned back. Marcus, there is one thing I should probably mention before I go. He looked up, that familiar condescending expression on his face. What's that? The quarterly tax statements came in yesterday. I left them on your desk in the study. You might want to review them soon. There are some discrepancies you'll want to address. The discrepancies, of course, were the result of Marcus having no idea that his accountant had been quietly moving funds between accounts to hide the fact that his firm was operating at a loss. The accountant, my accountant, though Marcus didn't know that, had been very careful to ensure that everything was perfectly legal, if somewhat revealing. Discrepancies? James asked, his lawyer instincts kicking in. Oh, I'm sure it's nothing, I said with a wave of my hand. Marcus is so good with numbers. I've never understood that world anyway. I left them there, walking through the penthouse I'd helped choose, past the art I'd helped select, through the life I'd helped build while building another one entirely in the shadows. Tomorrow, I'd move into my Cambridge apartment, the public face of my new life. But tonight, I had a board meeting to attend for Meridian Holdings, the company I'd founded 3 years ago and that now controlled more assets than Marcus had ever dreamed of touching. As I reached for my coat, my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Chen. Tomorrow's New York Times business section is going to be very interesting. Hope you're ready for the spotlight. I wasn't just ready. I'd been waiting for this moment for 3 years. The next morning, I woke up in my new Cambridge apartment to the sound of my phone ringing. Through the window, I could see the Charles River, calm and gray under the overcast sky. The apartment was small compared to the penthouse, but it was mine in every sense of the word, bought and paid for with money Marcus had never touched, decorated with furniture I'd chosen without consulting anyone, filled with books I actually wanted to read rather than ones that looked impressive on shelves. The caller ID showed Marcus's name. I let it ring through to voicemail. 2 minutes later, he called again. Then again. By the fourth call, I answered. Good morning, Marcus. What the hell did you do? His voice was raw, like he'd been shouting. The Times. The fucking New York Times, Victoria. I walked to my kitchen, small but efficient, everything in its place, and started my coffee. I'm afraid you'll have to be more specific. I don't read the business section much. Don't play dumb with me. Meridian Holdings. They're profiling the founder. Some mysterious woman who's been quietly buying up half of Boston's commercial real estate. Ring any bells? The coffee maker gurgled softly as I smiled. The Times piece had been inevitable once Meridian's portfolio reached a certain size. I'd known this day would come, had actually been looking forward to it. I might have seen something about that, I said. Quite impressive, whoever she is. Cut the shit, Victoria. The article mentions Cambridge real estate acquisitions. It mentions a connection to offshore investment firms. And it specifically mentions a property management company that just happens to own the building where my new office lease. He trailed off, the full implications hitting him. Your new office lease, I finished for him. The one you were so proud of negotiating. 30% below market rate, wasn't it? Excellent terms for the tenant. Silence stretched between us. I could picture him in the penthouse, probably standing at the same window where I'd watched the harbor yesterday, realizing that his brilliant negotiation had been a trap closing around him. How long? He asked finally. How long what? How long have you been this? Whatever this is. I poured my coffee, added a splash of cream, and settled into the reading chair I'd positioned perfectly by the window. Oh, Marcus. I've always been this. You just never bothered to look. The truth was more complicated, of course. I hadn't started out as a real estate mogul. But I'd started out as someone who paid attention, who listened when he and his friends talked about their deals over dinner, who understood that information was power and that being underestimated was the greatest advantage you could have. My grandmother's inheritance had been the seed money, but it was Marcus's own network that had taught me how to grow it. Every business dinner where I'd been introduced as just his wife, every charity board meeting where I'd been dismissed as a pretty face, every country club conversation where men assumed I wasn't listening, all of it had been my real education. You bought my building, he said, his voice hollow. You own the building where I signed a 5-year lease. I own a lot of buildings, Marcus. It's a solid investment strategy. And the clients? Henderson, Morrison, Blackstone Capital, they all moved their portfolios yesterday. All at once. That's not a coincidence. It wasn't a coincidence. It was business. When I discovered that 3 of Marcus's biggest clients were actually shell companies for money I'd been moving through various investment vehicles, it had been simple enough to consolidate those holdings elsewhere. Perfectly legal, utterly devastating to his quarterly numbers. I'm sure you'll bounce back, I said. You're very talented at, what is it you do again? Wealth management. His laugh was bitter. You destroyed me. Do you understand that? Those clients were my biggest accounts. Without them, I can't cover my overhead. The lease payments, the staff salaries, the payments on the Ferrari? The mortgage on the Cape House? The monthly allowance for Isabel's shopping habits. Another silence. Longer this time. How do you know about Isabel? Oh, Marcus. Did you really think I didn't know? The receipts for jewelry I never received, the restaurant charges for meals I didn't eat, the hotel bookings for weekends I spent at my sister's? I may not have been contributing financially to our marriage, but I was certainly paying attention to where the finances were going. What I didn't tell him was that I'd known about Isabel before he did. She'd been recommended to me by a friend who thought she'd be perfect for redecorating the Meridian Holdings offices. I'd met with her twice, found her ambitious and somewhat mercenary, and realized she'd be perfect for Marcus. A few carefully dropped hints at the right charity events, a strategic introduction at the country club bar, and nature had taken its course. But there was more to the story that Marcus would never know. 6 months ago, when I first suspected he was having an affair, I'd hired a private investigator, not to gather evidence for divorce proceedings, but to understand exactly what I was dealing with. The report had been illuminating. Marcus wasn't just cheating, he was in serious financial trouble. His investment firm was hemorrhaging money, not because of market conditions, but because of his own poor decisions. He'd been chasing high-risk, high-reward investments to fund his increasingly expensive lifestyle, and when those investments failed, he'd been using creative accounting to hide the losses. The investigator, a sharp woman named Detective Sarah Murphy, had uncovered a pattern of behavior that painted Marcus as someone desperate to maintain appearances at any cost. Expensive dinners charged to client accounts, business trips that were actually romantic getaways, even jewelry purchases that he'd somehow classified as office equipment. "Your husband is living beyond his means," Sarah had told me during our final meeting. "He's not just unfaithful, he's financially reckless. If you're planning to divorce him, you need to move fast before creditors start circling." That conversation had crystallized my plans. I hadn't just been building wealth, I'd been building a fortress. And it was a good thing, because Marcus's house of cards was about to collapse whether I pushed it or not. "You set me up," he said, the realization dawning. "All of it. The divorce, the settlement, even Isabel. You set all of it up." "I didn't set anything up, Marcus. I simply stopped preventing the inevitable." The truth was more nuanced. I hadn't introduced Marcus to Isabel to hurt him. I'd done it to give him what he clearly wanted, a woman who would admire his success without questioning its foundation. In a way, it was a kindness. Isabel was beautiful, ambitious, and perfectly willing to overlook financial irregularities as long as the lifestyle continued. They deserved each other. But I had also ensured that when Marcus's financial troubles caught up with him, I wouldn't be collateral damage. Every joint account had been quietly restructured, every shared investment had been unwound, every potential claim on my assets had been legally severed. By the time Marcus realized what was happening, I was already untouchable. The process had taken months of careful planning. Working with Sarah Chen, I'd created a complex web of legal protections that Marcus would never see coming. The key had been understanding the difference between what looked like marital property and what actually was marital property under Massachusetts law. Our Boston penthouse, for instance, appeared to be jointly owned. But the mortgage payments had been coming from a trust I'd established years earlier, using money that predated our marriage. Legally, Marcus was more of a tenant than an owner. The Ferrari he loved so much was leased through a company I controlled, not owned outright. Even his golf club membership had been a gift from my shell corporation, not a purchase he'd made himself. "You've just built yourself a lifeboat in a hurricane," Walter had said about my patent sale. He'd been more right than he knew. But the hurricane hadn't been market forces or business competition. It had been my own marriage. The most delicious irony was that Marcus had actually helped me perfect these arrangements without realizing it. Every time he'd bragged about a new tax shelter or investment strategy at dinner parties, I'd been taking notes. Every time his lawyer friends had discussed asset protection over drinks, I'd been listening. Marcus had essentially provided me with a master class in financial warfare, never imagining he'd someday be on the receiving end of those tactics. There was also the matter of his mother, Eleanor, who'd been so quick to dismiss me at that dinner party. What Marcus didn't know was that Eleanor's comfortable lifestyle was largely funded by dividends from investments she'd made with my guidance over the years. The trust fund she thought came from her late husband's insurance policy was actually a sophisticated investment vehicle I designed and managed. When she inevitably learned the truth about my identity, the cognitive dissonance would be spectacular. Dr. Hayes, Marcus's tennis partner, would face his own reckoning. The medical building where he practiced was owned by a subsidiary of Meridian Holdings. His lease was coming up for renewal next month, and the new terms would reflect current market rates rather than the friends and family discount Marcus had negotiated on his behalf. But perhaps the most satisfying element of my long-term strategy involved James Patterson, Marcus's attorney. Patterson thought he was so clever, crafting a divorce settlement that left me with scraps while protecting his client's assets. What he didn't know was that his own law firm's office building had been quietly acquired by Meridian Holdings 6 months ago. Patterson had been negotiating against his own landlord without realizing it. My phone buzzed with another call. Sarah Chen. I'd call her back later. Right now, I was enjoying this conversation too much to interrupt it. What do you want? Marcus asked. Money? Is this about money? Because if you think you can blackmail me. Blackmail? I laughed, genuinely amused. Marcus, I don't want anything from you. I already have everything I want. Then what's the point? If you're so rich, so powerful, why destroy me? Why not just leave? The question hung in the air, and for a moment I considered how to answer it. The truth was complex, part justice, part necessity, part simple human satisfaction. But mostly it was about something he'd never understand. Because, I said finally, you spent 8 years making me feel small. Every time you introduced me as just your wife, every time you dismissed my opinions, every time you made me feel like I was lucky to be married to you, you were making me smaller. And I got tired of being small. So you decided to make me small instead? No, Marcus. I decided to be exactly as large as I actually am. Your feeling small is just a side effect. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, could almost see him trying to process this new reality where his pretty, quiet wife was actually the mysterious mogul the Times was calling Boston's most powerful woman you've never heard of. The apartment, he said suddenly. The Cambridge apartment. That's not where you really live, is it? I really do live there, I said. I also live in a penthouse in Back Bay, a townhouse in Beacon Hill, a cottage on the Vineyard, and a cabin in Vermont. But yes, I really do live in Cambridge too. What I didn't mention was that each of those properties served a specific purpose in my larger strategy. The Cambridge apartment was my public face, modest, sympathetic, the kind of place a woman starting over might live. The Back Bay penthouse was my real home, the place where I could be myself without pretense. The Beacon Hill townhouse was an investment property that I rented to carefully vetted tenants. The Vineyard cottage was where I went when I needed to think, and the Vermont cabin was my backup plan, completely off the grid, stocked with supplies, and owned through a series of shell companies that would take years to trace back to me. And the settlement? The $50,000? Oh, I'll donate that to charity. There's a wonderful organization that helps women starting over after divorce. They do important work. The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus had insisted on the modest settlement because he'd wanted to maintain the fiction that he was being generous to his helpless ex-wife. Now that money would go to help women who were actually in the position he'd assumed I was in, financially vulnerable and starting over with nothing. But there was something else I hadn't told him about the settlement. The legal language was very specific about what constituted marital assets, and Marcus's attorney had been sloppy in their definitions. According to the divorce decree, I was entitled to half of all assets acquired during the marriage, but only assets that Marcus had disclosed. Since he'd never known about Meridian Holdings, my real estate portfolio, or my offshore investments, those assets had never been part of the marital estate in the first place. In effect, Marcus had negotiated away his claim to assets he'd never had a claim to, while protecting assets that were already hemorrhaging value. It was perhaps the worst deal in the history of divorce settlements. He was quiet for so long I thought he might have hung up. Finally, what happens now? Now? Now you figure out how to rebuild your life. Just like you expected me to do yesterday. And if I can't? If I lose everything? I sipped my coffee, watching a jogger make her way along the river path. The morning was getting brighter, the gray clouds starting to break apart. Then you'll discover what it's like to start over with nothing but your own abilities. Should be educational. The truth was, I'd already ensured that Marcus wouldn't lose everything. The financial difficulties that were about to engulf him were serious but not insurmountable, especially for someone with his connections and experience. He'd have to sell the penthouse, trade down the car, and live more modestly, but he wouldn't end up on the street. I wasn't cruel, despite what he might think. I was just done being his safety net. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet of my new apartment for a long time. The morning light was filling the room now, warm and golden, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years, completely, perfectly myself. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Times wants a follow-up interview. Ready to step into the spotlight officially. I typed back, more than ready. But first I had a few more calls to make. The first was to Isabel Cunningham. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright and confident. Victoria. How unexpected. Marcus mentioned you two were transitioning. I hope there are no hard feelings. None at all, I said warmly. Actually, I was calling with a business proposition. Oh. I'm expanding Meridian Holdings into interior design consultation for high-end commercial properties. Your work on Marcus's office was quite impressive. Would you be interested in discussing a contract? The pause that followed was everything I'd hoped for. Yes, absolutely. When would you like to meet? How about this afternoon? Say 2 o'clock at the Meridian offices? Meridian offices? In the Back Bay. The penthouse level of the Hartwell building. Security will have your name. Another pause. The Hartwell building. That's where my lease application was just approved. For my new studio space. What a coincidence, I said. I look forward to meeting with you, Isabel. The second call was to my sister Emma, the only person who'd known the full truth all along. How does it feel? She asked without preamble. Like taking off shoes that never fit properly, I said. And Marcus? Learning some difficult lessons about assumptions. Good. The bastard had it coming. Emma had never liked Marcus, had seen through his charm from the beginning. So what's next? World domination? Something like that. I laughed. Actually, I'm thinking about going public with Meridian. Taking the company international. About time. You've been hiding in the shadows long enough. She was right. For 6 years I'd been building an empire while pretending to be someone I wasn't. The divorce had been the last piece of camouflage I needed to shed. The third call was to my real estate attorney. The Marcus Lewis situation? He asked. Resolved. He'll be vacating the penthouse by month's end. Add it to the Meridian portfolio. Understood. And the other properties? Keep them for now. We'll see how he handles adversity. By noon, I was dressed for my first official day as the public face of Meridian Holdings. Navy suit, conservative but expensive. Heels that clicked with authority on marble floors. Hair pulled back in a style that said I was serious about business. The Meridian offices occupied the top 3 floors of the Hartwell building, a gleaming tower in Boston's financial district that I'd acquired 2 years ago. My actual office, not the small space Marcus thought I used for charity work, commanded a view of the harbor that made the penthouse vista look cramped. My assistant Jennifer had laid out the afternoon schedule. 3 acquisition meetings, a call with investors in London, and the interview with Isabel Cunningham. The Times wants to schedule a photo shoot, Jennifer said, handing me a stack of messages. And you have 17 interview requests from various business publications. Schedule the Times shoot for Friday. As for the interviews, let's be selective. Quality over quantity. At exactly 2 o'clock, security called to announce Isabel's arrival. I had Jennifer show her up, then waited in my office, seated behind the desk that had been custom-made from reclaimed ship timber. When Isabel walked in, her confidence faltered for just a moment as she took in the space, the artwork, the view, the obvious expense of everything around her. But she recovered quickly, extending her hand with a smile that was equal parts professional and calculating. "Victoria, this is impressive. I had no idea you were involved in commercial real estate." "There's a lot about me that might surprise people," I said, gesturing for her to take a seat. "Coffee? Water?" "Coffee would be lovely." I pressed the intercom. "Jennifer, could you bring coffee for two?" As we waited, Isabel looked around the office, her designer's eye cataloging details. When her gaze landed on the framed photo of me shaking hands with the mayor at a ribbon-cutting ceremony, I saw the moment when pieces began clicking into place. "You're her," she said suddenly. "The mystery woman from the Times article. You're the founder of Meridian Holdings." "I am." Jennifer brought the coffee, serving it in china cups with the Meridian logo. When she left, Isabel leaned forward slightly. "Does Marcus know?" "As of this morning, yes." "My God." She sat back, her expression shifting from confusion to understanding to something that might have been respect. "The divorce, the settlement, his business problems, you orchestrated all of it." "I wouldn't say orchestrated. That implies I forced people to make choices they didn't want to make. I simply created circumstances where people's true natures could emerge." Isabel was quiet for a moment, processing. Then the job offer. "The consultation work. Is that real, or is this part of some larger plan?" "It's real," I said. "Meridian is expanding into design consultation, and your work is genuinely impressive. But I want you to understand exactly what you'd be walking into." "Which is?" "A business relationship with a woman who just systematically dismantled her ex-husband's financial life. Some people might find that intimidating." Isabel smiled then, the first genuine expression I'd seen from her. "Some people might. Others might find it inspiring." "And which are you?" "Honestly? A little of both." She sipped her coffee, considering. "Marcus painted a very different picture of you. Quiet, domestic, somewhat limited." "Marcus saw what he expected to see. What he needed to see to feel comfortable with himself." "And now?" "Now he's learning that comfortable assumptions can be dangerous." We spent the next hour discussing the position, the scope of work, the compensation, the expectations. Isabel was sharp, asking pointed questions about growth projections and creative freedom. By the time she left, we'd agreed on a contract that would make her one of the highest-paid design consultants in the city. As she gathered her things to leave, she paused at the door. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Was any of it real? Your marriage, the life you built together?" It was a question I'd been asking myself since yesterday. "The marriage was real," I said finally. "The love was real, at least in the beginning. But the life we built, that was mostly him building a life and me helping to maintain it while building my own in secret." "Do you regret it? Any of it?" "I regret not being honest sooner. About who I was, what I was capable of. But I don't regret protecting myself." After she left, I stood at my office window, looking out over the city that was finally seeing me for who I really was. My phone rang, Marcus again, but I let it go to voicemail. Whatever he had to say could wait. 3 hours later, as I was reviewing acquisition reports for a hotel chain in Miami, Jennifer knocked on my office door. "Mrs. Lewis, sorry, Ms. Lewis, there's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent." "Who is it?" "Richard Blackwood. He says he's a friend of Marcus." I almost smiled. Richard, the country club king who'd sat at my dining table yesterday, smirking into his scotch while Marcus humiliated me. Now he was here, hat in hand, wanting something. "Send him in." Richard entered my office like a man walking to his execution. His usual swagger was nowhere to be found, replaced by the careful movements of someone who'd suddenly realized he was in unfamiliar territory. His eyes swept the room, taking in the obvious wealth, the commanding view, the power that radiated from every expensive surface. "Victoria," he said, his voice lacking its usual condescension. "Thank you for seeing me." Richard, please sit. I gestured to the same chair Isabel had occupied. What brings you to my office? He settled uncomfortably, his manicured hands fidgeting with his cufflinks. I think we both know why I'm here. Actually, I don't. Why don't you enlighten me? The Blackwood development contract. The one my company signed with Meridian Holdings last month. I had no idea, that is, I didn't realize. That you were doing business with Marcus's ex-wife? I finished for him. The woman you watched him humiliate yesterday while you laughed into your drink. His face flushed red. Victoria, I want you to know that I never meant any disrespect. Marcus presented the situation in a certain way and You believed him because it was easier than thinking for yourself. I leaned back in my chair, studying him. The development contract for the waterfront project, Richard. $47 million over 3 years. Quite a substantial deal for Blackwood development. Yes, it is. And I want to assure you that we're fully committed to delivering exceptional work. This project will be what exactly? Because the environmental impact reports are still pending, the city permits have some irregularities, and your financing structure seems to depend heavily on pre-sales that haven't materialized. The color drained from his face. He'd clearly hoped this would be a simple social call, maybe an opportunity to smooth things over with some charm and a few apologies. He hadn't expected to be confronted with the technical details of his company's precarious position. I'm sure we can work through any complications, he said carefully. I'm sure you can. The question is whether Meridian Holdings wants to be associated with those complications. I picked up a file from my desk, one of several that Jennifer had prepared for this inevitable conversation. Did you know that 3 of your major subcontractors have liens against them? Or that your project manager was fired from his last job for cost overruns that bankrupted a smaller development company? Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Where did you get that information? I make it my business to know who I'm working with, Richard. Due diligence. You might have heard of it. Look, Victoria, if this is about yesterday, about what happened at Marcus's place, I want you to know that I deeply regret. This isn't about yesterday, I interrupted. This is about today. About tomorrow. About whether Meridian Holdings continues to honor contracts with companies that don't meet our standards. What standards? Competence. Integrity. Basic human decency. He sat forward, desperation creeping into his voice. Victoria, please. This project is everything to my company. If Meridian pulls out, we'll lose our primary financing. The whole deal will collapse. That sounds like a problem you should have considered before treating people like they were beneath your notice. For a long moment, we stared at each other across my desk. Richard was a man who'd spent his entire career being on the winning side, being part of the inner circle, being one of the boys who made the decisions while others lived with the consequences. Now, for the first time, he was experiencing what it felt like to be on the other side of that power dynamic. What do you want? He asked finally. I want you to understand something, Richard. Yesterday, you sat in my dining room and watched a man tear down his wife for your entertainment. You laughed when he called me accommodating. You smirked when he talked about my position in life. You did all of that because you thought I was powerless. I was wrong. I see that now. Do you? Because I'm not convinced you see anything except the threat to your bottom line. He was quiet for a moment, his jaw working like he was trying to find the right words. You're right, he said finally. I am an ass. Marcus was treating you terribly, and I went along with it because it was easier than speaking up. That makes me a coward. It wasn't the eloquent apology I might have hoped for, but it had the ring of truth. The Blackwood contract stays in place, I said after a pause. For now. But I want you to understand that every decision Meridian makes going forward will be evaluated based on our standards. And those standards include how our partners treat people, especially people they think can't fight back. Relief flooded his face. Thank you. I won't forget this. I hope not. Because the next time you're in a room where someone is being diminished for someone else's entertainment, I hope you remember this conversation. After he left, I sat quietly for a few minutes, processing the encounter. It had been satisfying in a way, but also exhausting. This was what the next few months would be like, people from my old life suddenly realizing they needed to recalibrate their relationship with me. Some, like Richard, would adapt. Others would dig in their heels and try to pretend nothing had changed. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "We need to talk. Tonight. Please." I stared at the message for a long time before typing back. "Tomorrow.
上午10点.
Meridian offices. Bring your attorney." The response came quickly. "Why my attorney?" "Because we're going to discuss your options." That evening, I drove to my real home, not the Cambridge apartment, but the penthouse in Back Bay that I'd owned for 3 years. It was smaller than the Beacon Hill place I'd shared with Marcus, but it was entirely mine. Every piece of furniture, every painting, every book had been chosen because I loved it, not because it projected the right image. The living room windows faced west, offering a perfect view of the sunset over the Charles River. I poured myself a glass of wine, a bottle I'd been saving for a special occasion, and settled into my favorite chair to watch the sky turn gold and pink. My sister Emma called just as the last light was fading. "How was your first day as a public mogul?" she asked. "Educational." I had visits from both Isabel and Richard Blackwood. "Both trying to figure out which way the wind is blowing?" "Something like that." Isabel was actually refreshing. She understood immediately what had happened and seemed genuinely impressed. Richard was. Richard. Scared and scrambling. "And Marcus?" "Meeting tomorrow. He wants to discuss his options." "What options does he have?" "That depends on how quickly he can adjust to his new reality." Emma was quiet for a moment. "Are you enjoying this? The revenge part?" It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself all day. "I'm not enjoying seeing people suffer," I said slowly. "But I am enjoying not being invisible anymore. For 8 years, I've been the woman in the background, the supporting character in someone else's story. Now I'm the protagonist of my own life." "Good. You deserve to be the protagonist." After we hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness, thinking about the question Emma had asked. Was I enjoying the revenge? The honest answer was complicated. I didn't take pleasure in Marcus's pain, but I did take satisfaction in the justice of it all. For too long, he'd treated our marriage like a business arrangement where he held all the power and I provided services. Now he was learning what it felt like to be the junior partner in a negotiation. The next morning, I arrived at the Meridian offices early, before the sun had fully risen over the harbor. I liked the quiet of the building in these early hours, the way my footsteps echoed in the marble lobby, the way the elevator carried me up through floors of sleeping offices to my domain at the top. Jennifer arrived at 8, bringing coffee and the morning schedule. "Mr. Lewis and his attorney are confirmed for 10, she said. "James Patterson from Patterson, write your associates." "Good. And the Times photographer?" "Scheduled for 11:30. They want to do the shoot in your office and then some exterior shots on the building's roof deck." At exactly 10 o'clock, security called to announce Marcus's arrival. I had Jennifer show them to the conference room rather than my office. This was business now, not personal. Marcus looked terrible. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his suit wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept. James Patterson, by contrast, looked crisp and professional, though I caught him glancing around the conference room with obvious appreciation for the expensive furnishings. "Marcus," I said, taking my seat at the head of the table. "James, thank you for coming." "Victoria," Marcus said, his voice hoarse. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened, and I want you to know." "This isn't a social call," I interrupted gently. "This is a business meeting. James, I assume you've had time to review your client's situation." Patterson opened his briefcase, pulling out a folder thick with documents. "I've reviewed the immediate concerns, yes. The client relocations, the lease obligations, the credit issues. It's challenging. Challenging is one word for it. Catastrophic might be more accurate. Marcus flinched, but I kept my tone professional. Here's what I'm prepared to offer, I continued. Meridian Holdings will provide bridge financing to keep Marcus's firm operational for the next 6 months. No interest, no penalties, no interference in operations. Both men stared at me in surprise. There are conditions, I continued. First, Marcus signs a personal guarantee on the loan, secured by his remaining assets. Second, he enters into a management consulting agreement with Meridian, where we provide oversight to ensure the firm returns to profitability. Third, he signs a comprehensive NDA regarding any business dealings he may have observed during our marriage. What kind of oversight? Patterson asked. Monthly financial reviews, approval authority for major expenditures, and veto power over client acceptance. Think of it as intensive care for a failing business. Marcus's face was pale. You want to take over my company? I want to save your company. There's a difference. You built something valuable, Marcus, but you've been running it into the ground with poor decisions and expensive distractions. This gives you a chance to rebuild without losing everything. And if I refuse? I slid a second folder across the table. Then Meridian calls in the debts we're owed, your remaining clients receive notice of our concerns about your firm's stability, and you declare bankruptcy within 60 days. Patterson opened the folder, his eyebrows rising as he scanned the contents. These are substantial claims. All legitimate and well documented. James, your client, has 36 hours to decide. After that, the offer expires and we proceed with collection activities. Marcus looked at me across the table, and for a moment I saw a flash of the man I'd married, the one who'd been charming and ambitious and eager to conquer the world. But that man had disappeared somewhere along the way, replaced by someone who confused cruelty with strength. Why? He asked quietly. Why offer me anything at all? Because despite everything, I don't want to see you destroyed. I want to see you learn. After they left, I sat in the conference room for a few minutes, watching the harbor through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Ships moved slowly across the water, their wakes spreading behind them like the consequences of choices made and unmade. The Times photographer arrived early, an energetic woman named Kate who immediately began assessing the light and angles in my office. As she worked, she asked questions about the business, about my background, about what it felt like to step out of the shadows. The article is calling you Boston's most powerful hidden woman, she said, adjusting her camera settings. How does it feel to not be hidden anymore? Like I can finally breathe, I said, and realized it was true. The photo shoot took an hour, with shots of me at my desk by the windows in the conference room where I'd just delivered an ultimatum to my ex-husband. Kate was professional but curious, clearly intrigued by the story behind the story. One more question, she said as she packed up her equipment. Any advice for other women who might be building something in secret? I thought about it for a moment. Don't stay secret longer than you have to. The world needs to see what you're capable of. That afternoon, I received a call from Patterson. Marcus had accepted the deal. Tomorrow, the Times interview would run, along with photos of me in this office, in this building, claiming this space that had always been mine. There would be more interviews, more opportunities, more people suddenly eager to work with the woman they'd been dismissing for years. But today, I simply stood in my real office, in my real life, being my real self for the first time in 8 years. It felt like coming home.